to Tennessee's At-Home Learning Series for Literacy. Today's lesson is for all our 6th graders out there, though all children are welcome to tune in. This lesson is the 2nd in our series. My name is Megan Gilley, and I'm a 6th grade teacher in Tennessee schools. I'm so excited to be your teacher for this lesson. Welcome to my virtual classroom. Today, we will continue to learn about the Middle Ages. However, if you didn't see our previous lesson, you can find it at the Tennessee Department of Education's website at www.tn.gov/education. You can still tune in to today's lesson if you haven't seen our others, but it might be more fun if you first go back and watch our other lesson, since we'll be talking about the things that we learned previously. The materials that you will need for today are 2 pieces of paper and a pen or pencil, as well as a hard surface to write on. What's our literary focus for today? So we're going to be learning about the the Middle Ages, also known as the medieval ages, and we're focusing on, though, as readers, how can we read like historians and cite evidence to support what the text is saying when we're asked questions of us. In addition, we're going to be thinking about how individuals are developed throughout the text. We're going to be looking at vocabulary that is meaningful in our reading. And we're going to use all of these details that we cite evidence on today to then go into writing. Today, you're going to be writing a narrative or a short story that uses important key details from the text. So it's important that you tune in and listen really well today. So let's begin. Yesterday, we took a look at how the Roman Empire changed under Charles the Great and formed Europe during the Middle Ages. Remember, if you look at the map on your screen, Europe was made up of 5 countries, which made up New Europe. So we have England in the upper left-hand corner. Below England, we have France. Below France, we have Spain. In the upper right-hand corner, we have Germany. And then we have Italy. That looks like a boot in the bottom right-hand corner. We also talked about how changes began to occur under Charlemagne, or Charles the Great's government system called feudalism. Remember, that was focused on land ownership, which then created 2 different groups of people. We had the rich and the poor. Today, we're going to dive deeper into the rich, who are called the lords, and the poor, who were called serfs. So we're going to start by doing some read-alouds, just to be building some background information about this topic further. As we read, I want you to think about the opportunities that the ladies and lords had and be able to use these examples as a definition for the privileged. So follow along with me. If you lived during the Middle Ages, your life followed one of a few set paths. If you were the child of a king and a queen, or a lord and a lady, you lived a privileged life. You had enough food to eat and clothes to wear. You lived in a relatively nice house. You had servants too. You may have been one of the few who learned to read and write. You even learned to ride a horse. If you were a boy, you learned to become a skilled swordsman. Privileged girls may have learned to embroider, to dance, and to play a musical instrument. Occasionally, girls too learned to read. As a privileged child, you likely grew up to become a king or a queen or a lord or a lady yourself. Okay, readers, now that we've finished that section, I want us to find evidence that supports the examples that show that both the lords and the ladies lived a privileged life. So I'm going to take my highlighter, and I can see here in the text it says that you may have been one of the few who learned to read and write. In addition, it also shows that you might have even been able to learn to ride a horse. Also, privileged girls, it shows, may have learned to embroider, to dance, and to play a musical instrument. And sometimes the girls were even able to read. So, as we continue on, I want you to think about the lifestyle of a serf. So follow along with me. But most people in the Middle Ages were not privileged. In the early Middle Ages, nearly everyone in Europe worked on the land. Most farm workers were called serfs. Serfs grew the food and tended to the livestock, or animals, that fed the people. Some had more freedom than others and were called freemen. Serfs were at the bottom of the social order and had the least amount of power. So I want us to think about these questions, and I'm going to pick up my highlighter as I can highlight evidence in the text. The first question says, what were the poor called during the Middle Ages? Well, again, here in the text I can see it says that most farm workers were called serfs. Yes, serfs. And I want you to think about, what did they do for a living? Well, you can see in that exact sentence that it uses the word farm workers. So these people were farm workers and worked on the land, growing food and tended to the livestock. And you can see that supported underneath, or the animals too, that fed the people. Lastly, would you consider serfs to be more privileged than most people? And the answer is no. Serfs, in the text it says, were at the bottom of the social order and had the least amount of power. As we continue on, I want us in this next section to think about, well, then what were the differences between the serfs and the lords? So serfs usually spent their entire lives working on a landowner's or lord's estate. In return for the work they did, the lord allowed serfs to use some of the land to grow their own food. The lord lived in his castle or manor house. He owned all the land around his home and often the nearby towns and villages too. The lord also controlled the lives of most of the people who worked for him. So in this section, I want you to think about, what is another name for a castle used during the Middle Ages? Do you see it? It's right there in front of me. It says that the lord lived in his castle or manor house. So if you thought manor house, you are correct. Okay, readers, what is the relationship then between a lord and a serf? On the previous slide, remember that we learned quite a bit about serfs, and here we can see a little bit of the interaction that there is between a lord and a serf. And so you'll see here that it said the lord controlled the lives of most of the people who worked for him. So when we think about their relationship, you're right, the lord has power over the serfs because he's the one that owned the land. Let's read on. Continue thinking about these differences in serfs and lords. Serfs were not educated. They did not learn to read or write. If serfs wanted to travel to a nearby town, they needed permission from the lord. When serfs wanted to marry, the lord had the right to approve or disapprove of the match. When serfs had children, those children usually grew up to work as serfs for the same lord. So let's find the proof, readers. Who had more power and freedom in the Middle Ages? Serfs or lords? See if you can find it in the text. All right, that's right. The serfs did not have as much power as the lords. And it shows here in the text that they, referring to serfs here, needed permission from the lord, meaning the lord had control over them. In addition, it says, why do the lords have more power? I want you to think about that. If you think back to our previous slide, we remember that the lords controlled the land, and at the end of the day, that's why the lords had more power. Let's continue on. As we read, I want you to think about the life of a serf even more. Let's dive just a little bit deeper, readers. In the Middle Ages, serfs worked on farmland that was divided into strips. The serfs spent about half of their time working for the Lord, and the rest of the time they worked on the strips of land where their own crops were grown. Most serfs lived in small, simple houses in or near a village. Their houses were made from wood and mud. The roofs were thatched, meaning they were usually made from rushes or straw. They usually had just one room, and serfs slept on straw beds. Could you imagine straw beds? Inside, each house was a small fireplace for cooking. Smoke from the fire escaped through a hole in the roof. Readers, we have a lot of description here of the serf and his or her living quarters. So I want you to be thinking about, if we had to describe the houses in which the serfs lived, what text details, what descriptions do we have of the serfs' homes? And so I'm going to get my highlighter here again, and I'm going to be thinking about the text. It tells me that they were small, simple houses. What else does the text say? You're right, the next detail says that they were made from wood and mud. What else is another description of this house? The roofs were thatched, meaning they were made of straw. What else, readers? What other details do we get about the houses in which serfs lived? I see this detail. They had just one room. They slept on straw beds. What other description do we have here? You can see I'm just logically going through each sentence in the text till we get toward the end. And I can see we do have two more descriptions. Inside each house was a small fireplace, and smoke from the fire escaped through a hole through the roof. Okay? I want you to think, as we continue on, about how lords made their money. And so the Lord increased his wealth in many different ways. In addition to working the farmland for the Lord, serfs paid taxes to the Lord in form of money, crops, and livestock. Sometimes the Lord ran a mill and even charged his serfs a fee to grind their grain into flour. Do we know how a lord became richer, wealthier through his serfs? Think about that. How did a lord become even richer or wealthier through his serfs? Well, the very first sentence says that the Lord increased his wealth in many different ways. We can see in the text that it tells us that serfs had to pay taxes to the Lord in the form of money, crops, and livestock. Even sometimes he charged his serfs for them to grind their grain into flour. So we can see how these details from the text help support that question. And I'm starting to think that it almost appears like the serfs have trouble, I guess, trying to improve their lives. So we'll read on just a little bit further. If crops failed or illness struck, people during the Middle Ages struggled to survive. In times of hardship, the Lord did not always come to the aid of his serfs. Even when food supplies were low, serfs were not allowed to hunt in the Lord's forest. Seems a bit cruel, especially if they were hungry. However, to avoid starving, people sometimes hunted illegally. This was called poaching, and serfs who were caught poaching were severely punished. And so I'm thinking about the desperation that some of the serfs experienced when it came to their particular hunger. So I want you to think about, why were serfs unable to hunt? Yes, that's right. The Lord considered this to be poaching when they hunted illegally, or in this case, without permission. In your opinion, would you consider the hunting that they did poaching? Think about that for a minute. I wouldn't either. I could not believe that they had to face such severe punishment if a serf hunted on the Lord's land. Especially if they were hungry, I would want them to have food. Did the punishment stop the serfs from hunting, though? We can see here in the text that to avoid starving, in that same sentence right before, to avoid starving, people did go ahead and hunt illegally. When people are so desperate for food, in this case with the serfs, they went ahead and did what they needed to be able to provide for themselves with the food they needed. So I want to make sure that we understand the difference between a serf and a freedman and lords. So follow along with me. We're going to learn about freemen. Some farm workers were freemen. Freemen were not under the same strict control of the lord. If a serf ran away from his home and managed to live for a year and a day in town without being found, he could become a freeman too. The Middle Ages was a violent time compared to how we live today. There were frequent wars and uprisings, including rebellions against the king by rival nobles. The need for armed protection shaped medieval society. Usually high-ranking nobles swore their loyalty to the king, and lords swore their loyalty to higher-ranking nobles. Freemen and serfs had to be loyal to their lord. In exchange for their loyalty, the lord offered his protection. If the lord needed to raise an army, he would require freemen on his estates to serve as foot soldiers. I find all this information very interesting, but we have a few questions that we're going to focus on to make sure that we have the important details out of this section. What really is the main difference between a freeman and serf? I want you to think about that, and where in the text could we find evidence to support that? I can see here, I'm going to pick up my highlighter, it says that freemen were not under the same strict control of the lord. So that's really the main difference. Serfs had more regulations than freemen did. And why was medieval society organized for war? Based on the text here, why was medieval society organized for war? That's right, it was a violent time. Here in the text, it tells us that the Middle Ages was a violent time compared to how we live today. There were frequent wars and uprisings, including rebellions against the king by rival nobles. So they needed armed protection, which shaped medieval society. In addition, what were the benefits for the serfs in this situation? Think about that. What were the benefits? Honestly, I don't think there's any benefits either. But when I read just a little bit further, what caught me at the very end is that in exchange for loyalty by both the freemen and the serfs, the lord offered his protection. So I suppose that's a benefit for the serf there. In addition, who did the lord require to fight if he needed to put together an army for the king? Think about that. Who did the Lord require to fight if he needed to put together an army? Well, here in the text I can see it says if the Lord needed to raise an army, he would require footmen on his estates to serve. And so I think about question 5, well, why is it that the serfs didn't have to fight? Why do you think that? Why do you think the Lord did not make the serfs fight? Think about it. I was wondering if the only way he could keep the serfs from running away and become a freeman is if he kept them protected in his sight. I was also wondering, well, who would work the farm if all the serfs were fighting? So both of those reasons might be why the Lord chooses to have freemen fight instead. So let's compare. We're going to take a look at the differences between the lords and the serfs: homes, work, clothing, food, and amount of power. So at this time, I want you to pull out one of your pieces of paper, and we're going to split it just like I am on my screen. So I want you to pick up your pencil and you're going to make a 3-column chart. And on the very left-hand side, I want you to label this column with Lords. And on the right-hand side, I want you to label your column with Serfs. I'm sorry about my handwriting, but hopefully you can see there. In the center, we're going to label this section categories because there were a couple categories on the last screen that we needed to look at. So again, we've labeled our paper into 3 columns. And now we're going to jot down the differences for the lords and serfs in each category. So let's write down the categories that we have, okay? So the very first category is homes. I'm going to skip a few lines, draw a line over. And the next category is work. I want to be thinking about, well, how is the lord's work different than the serfs? And then I'm going to be thinking about clothing. How were the lords' clothing described differently than the serfs? I'm also going to be thinking about food. When it came to food, can you recall that important detail about what the lords had an abundance of maybe versus the serfs? And lastly, when we think about the amount of power, how are lords different than the serfs? So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes, and I want you to try on your own, readers, to think about all of the information that we learned. It's really important that when we get so much information, we want to condense it to the most important details. And so creating a chart like this is one of the ways that we can collect the most important pieces of information. We're going to be using this chart when we get to our writing today. So I want you to take about a minute and then we'll move on. Okay, start with homes. What were the lords' homes described as? Just trying to help you, and you can work ahead. That's completely fine. I hope you're at home jotting down your notes as you're thinking. If you're stuck, I might think about, okay, well, the lords' homes I know were described as castles, which we can all probably visualize what a castle might be like. In comparison to the serfs, some of the details about the serfs' home, I'm like, what was important that stood out? I remember that they were small homes. I remember there was one room a lot of the times. I recall that they slept in a straw bed. I want you to continue thinking about these details. Use my model to help you. Okay, so I want you, whether you're finished or not, and that's okay, I want you to be thinking, readers, that the lords had so much power over the serfs. The serfs had to get permission from the lords to do many things, such as travel to a nearby town or to get married, but the lords did not have to have that sort of permission. In addition, serfs didn't have any ability, again, to leave the lord's manor. He also had to consider marriages, children, and travel based on time. So some of these facts should be revealed through your own chart. So when it's said and done, readers, you might end up having something that looks a little like what's up on my screen here. And you will see all of the different details. And this is what we are going to use to be able to write our next component. And you're going to be doing that task independently, okay? So today on your own, I want you to write a story titled A Day in the Life of a Blank. So we read all of this information about lords and serfs today, and we just tried to make a chart that shows the differences in those particular categories. And so your challenge independently on your own is to think about writing a story. You are going to choose your character. I want you to think about, okay, well, am I going to be a serf or am I going to be a lord? Because your story is going to be so different. But in your story, I want you to make sure that you include what type of home you have, what it is that you do for work, what you wear, what you eat, and how much power you have. It's also important, writers, that every good story uses details from the text to support your character. I also want you to think about every good story also has a problem. So what problem might your serf have, or your lord, depending on the character of your choice? And how is that conflict maybe going to be resolved in the end? I want to give you just about 30 seconds to be thinking about your story and brainstorming, what could you write about based on the details that you have about serfs and lords? You're the experts in this with this information, so I want you to think about it. Just a key tip, all strong writers take time to plan their writing, and so it's okay that it's going to take you some time to think about your story today, but I want to challenge you to write a well-written story that includes the details up on the screen today. I cannot wait to read your stories. But as we come to a close today, boys and girls, I have enjoyed learning about the Middle Ages with you. Thank you for inviting me into your home. I look forward to seeing you in our next lesson series in Tennessee's At Home Learning Series for Literacy. If you want to view today's lesson, please remember that you can go out to www.tn.gov/education, and I look forward to seeing you in our next lesson.